This is an overview of women in antebellum America from 1800 to 1860. There's a few areas that I want to explore, some new themes that are going to be popping up in the 1800s, the 19th century. The first is the concept of reform, which when we're thinking of reform, we're thinking about the desire, the need to improve society, to improve people's social, economic, working positions. And what we see throughout the 19th century is a multitude of voluntary societies opening, which included, benevolent associations or charitable associations that really focused on some of the problems that came about with industrialization. And these reform societies, these voluntary societies, really transformed and pushed the boundaries of women's public roles. So really opening opportunities for them to get involved in what otherwise might be seen as men's work. So we'll go into that a little bit more. We also see the evolution of the ideology of public versus private spheres, which we'll be talking about in a second. The idea that there are appropriate areas for men to dwell and appropriate areas for women to dwell in society. And then what we also see is throughout the 19th century, a growing separation of women and men's lives, very unlike the colonial era when men and women are working sometimes alongside each other, if not within the same household, on the same farm, in the same family business. As industrialization develops in America, we see just a greater separation between gender. So let's start with the ideology of true womanhood, this idea of the separate spheres. Where did it come from? It's sometimes known as the cult of domesticity or the cult of true womanhood. This is really the ideology of the separate spheres, that there is a public sphere and a private sphere in society, and the public is for the masculine. It is one of business, politics, economic matters, governing matters, all these things that are more suited for men, right? They're considered to be areas that there's more corruption, and therefore it's not fit for women. The private sphere becomes the woman's domain. This is where women are specializing, so to speak. So the private sphere would include anything to do with the home or the family, right? And what comes about, and you'll see this more towards the mid 19th century, is this notion that women's agency, how they can have influence, is in the home. It's with family. It's with child rearing. Anything to do with the home is where women can find their power, and that's where they're just believed to have a greater ability and more natural abilities. So this is kind of the ideology. And what we see is that throughout the literature, magazines, literature, novels, these ideas about women and men being so different, so yin and yang from each other, yet so complementary to each other also, made it so that women were defined in sometimes new terms from the colonial era. What it meant to be a good, quote unquote, good woman was to be pious, to be very, Protestant Christian, follow the Bible, be the moral compass to the family. To be pure. Purity was another mark of a good woman, saving sex till marriage, not being overly sexual, being virtuous, being putting the good of the community, of the family, ahead of one's own, um, being selfless, right? These are all marks of what a good woman was in the Victorian antebellum era. And class and race really posed challenges to this ideology. For, as we'll see, women who are of lower class, of working class, they have to work to supplement the family's economy, their economic wages, and they don't have the ability to maybe stay home and focus solely on the family and the kids. This was also something that was really constructed by these Western European notions about gender, and we're particularly focusing on white women, not African American women or Native American women. So we almost exclusively see this ideology of what it means to be a true woman, focusing on middle class white women. In the image here, you have a mother, with her baby and watching over her kids as they read. This is what it looked like to be a good woman, to be maternal. So what we see how it is applied in the North with middle-class Northern white women. Generally, birth rates are declining in the industrial era. Less kids is a way of focusing more on the family. If you have less kids to teach and to nurture, then you're going to be able to perfect your role as a mother and perfect these children more. So we see birth rates starting to decline, but also economically, children aren't as vital to the family's economy, right? They're not going to be working on the farm as we see more and more people moving into industrial work, out of the farms and into more urban dwellings. So if anything, children become somebody that you have to feed and financially are responsible for. They're not as beneficial to the family's economy anymore. That, in conjunction with how the household technologies are changing, you start to see inventions like the cast iron stove being introduced to a lot of middle class families, and that really freed up some time for women to again focus on being this quote unquote best woman that they could be, making meals, making things for the family at home. So all of this leads to this idea that these women have more time to devote to their family, and also to now benevolent associations, right? You start to see this is where reform comes in. A lot of middle-class white women working through church groups and opening charitable associations for, lower class women or women who are not religious. And they are focusing on helping and uplifting these poor and unsaved people. In the North, we also see the evolution of a potentially new opportunity for white women, and that was as industrial workers. The first that we see opening in Lowell, Massachusetts. They opened their doors to young single women who could go and earn some wages, in between the time they were too old to be living at home and before they got married. And a lot of times these women would work to send money back to their homes, to their families, but they also got a taste of what it was like to earn wages for themselves and have that sense of independence. And They lived with other young single women in the dormitories in Lowell, and really just got a new opportunity that really wouldn't have been available prior to the industrial era. You also see the growing class consciousness of these young women as they are living and working together. We see the first strike in 1836 that probably came to much of a surprise to a lot of the workers and managers at Lowell, that they would start to detest their working conditions or their wages or what was being asked of their productivity, and they strike. And later, they go on to form the first labor union in 1844, the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association. So with this opportunity also comes this sort of new area of complaint in an area of reform with labor unions, particularly for these young girls. As time goes on, a lot of the incoming immigrants from Ireland and Germany, and they will start to work in these industrial factories, textile factories like at Lowell, and they will no longer be for kind of these young lower or middle class young girls anymore. We also see that for the working class families, domesticity, this true womanhood, was not really a fitting reality for the tenements. And the tenements, again, are just these really densely packed in, basically apartment complexes that start to develop in the cities. You start to see it in New York first, and it spreads throughout the West, like in Chicago and elsewhere, where there's not a lot of resources or time to devote to perfecting one's home and entertaining and all of that middle class women were generally afforded. So domesticity and this kind of ideology, even though it may have been widely embraced across class, it did not necessarily fit in as a reality for the working class. Moving on to the South. White women in the South, the South generally is just a much more patriarchal society, where there's a definite hierarchy because of slavery, because of just the kind of Southern honor that the sort of feudal system operates under. So just to know that it's just a much more patriarchal society than even in the North. In the North, women were sort of seen as equal to men in the sense that they have the things that they're good at, like domesticity, but they're not necessarily equal in business, so I guess that's my timer telling me to move on. We see that they're valued in a way that women's domesticity or their nurturing qualities are not quite as seen as equal or egalitarian in the South. So the elite of the population, which we would consider to be those who had a lot of land and at least 10 or more slaves, only equaled about a fourth of the population. That means 3/4 of the white population in the South either have less than 10 slaves or don't own slaves at all. And for the elite women in the South, their experiences were very different from those women in the North. They are much more isolated in the South. Usually plantations or farms are at least 15 miles from each other. So getting together and, gossiping or, having friendly chit chat was not as easy as it was for the North, where people are living more densely together. The elite women of the South are marked by their life of leisure. They have a lot more time and a lot less work to do than women in the North because of slavery. We see, I gotta pause here.